Hello, and welcome back to our quiet corner of the internet. Settle in, find a comfortable space, and let the noise and the glare of the modern world recede. Tonight we are taking a journey. It is not a journey to a distant land of myth or a forgotten battlefield, but to a place far more unsettling. We are traveling into the deepest, most shadowed valley of the human psyche, a place where the lines between desire and depravity, life and death, simply cease to exist. Our destination is the south of France, specifically the region of Provence at the turn of the 20th century. When we think of Provence, we conjure images of vibrant lavender fields stretching to the horizon, of sun-drenched vineyards, ancient Roman ruins basking in a golden light, and the gentle warm breeze of the Mediterranean. It is a landscape of profound beauty, a place that has inspired artists and poets for centuries. But tonight, our story is not one of light and beauty. It is a story from the shadows that linger even under the brightest Provençal sun. We are going to a small, unassuming town called Meuilly, a place that became the epicenter of a horror so profound, so fundamentally aberrant, it seems to belong to the darkest realms of Gothic fiction. This is a piece of historical true crime that pushes the very boundaries of what we consider human. It forces us to confront a taboo so absolute, so universally reviled, that even speaking of its necrophilia can feel like a transgression. It is a story of the dead, and of one man's monstrous, all-consuming obsession with them. We are here to understand the life and crimes of the man the sensationalist press of the day would crown with a terrifying title, the Vampire of Meuilly. His real name was Victor Ardisson, and it is crucial to understand from the outset, he was not a creature of supernatural folklore. He did not have fangs or a fear of the cross. He was a man of flesh and blood, a husband, a neighbor, a laborer, and a gravedigger. It was in the hallowed silence of the cemetery, under the solemn watch of cypress trees and weeping stone angels, that he committed acts so vile they sent a shudder through the whole of France. His case would become a foundational and deeply disturbing subject of study in the burgeoning controversial new field of criminal psychology. Tonight, we will not merely recount his crimes. We will attempt to build his world. We will walk the dusty streets of his town, feel the social pressures of his era, and try to grasp the context in which such a man could exist, and for so long go undetected. We will piece together the scattered fragments of his unremarkable life to understand how it gave birth to such remarkable monstrosity. We will follow the chilling trail of whispers, rumors, and desecrations that ultimately led the law to his door. We will sit in the courtroom of his sensational trial, a trial that became a battleground not just for one man's fate, but for the very soul of criminology, pitting traditional notions of good and evil against radical new theories of medicine and the mind. This French crime story is more than just a litany of gruesome acts. It's a snapshot of a specific moment in history, the Belle Époque, or beautiful era, a time of immense optimism, technological progress, and cultural vibrancy, but also a time of deep-seated anxieties about heredity, social decay, and the darkness lurking beneath the polished surface of civilization. It is a story about how we define evil, how we classify madness, and what a society does when it is confronted by a compulsion that seems to defy all reason. So please take a deep breath. Prepare yourself. We are about to metaphorically unlatch the rusted iron gates of the cemetery of Meuilly, and descend into the chilling, disturbing, and profoundly human story of Victor Ardisson. To truly understand the enigma of Victor Ardisson, we must first understand the world that made him. He was born in 1872 in Le Plan de la Tour, a small hamlet clinging to the hillsides near the larger town of Meuilly. This was the French Third Republic, a political entity forged in the crucible of defeat after the Franco-Prussian War. While Paris was becoming the luminous heart of the Belle Époque city of world's fairs, electric lights, the brand new Eiffel Tower, and the cancan dancers of the Moulin Rouge, rural France, and especially the deep south of Provence, remained a world apart. Here life moved to the rhythm of the seasons, not the ticking of a factory clock. It was a world of profound poverty, deep-rooted tradition, and a stoic, almost grim, acceptance of hardship. Ardisson's family was, by all accounts, poor and unremarkable. They were farm laborers, part of a vast rural peasantry whose lives had changed little for centuries. Victor was one of several children, receiving only the most rudimentary education mandated by the new republic. He learned to read and write, but not much more. From his earliest days, he was marked by a certain slowness, a quality described by those who knew him as simple-mindedness. He was not overtly disabled, but there was a perceptible lag in his comprehension, a placid vacancy in his expression. In the harsh, unsentimental world of rural labor, this made him an object of mild ridicule, a boy who was always a step behind the others. He was quiet, solitary, and rarely participated in the rough-and-tumble games of other children, preferring his own company. There were no dramatic, foreshadowing acts of cruelty in his youth, no stories of torturing animals or setting fires that profilers look for today. His childhood was a study in beige, a long, quiet stretch of anonymity. This very lack of drama is, in itself, unsettling. It suggests his pathology was not born of a singular trauma, but was instead a slow, creeping vine that grew quietly in the shadows of his unremarkable mind. As a young man, he followed the expected path. He worked a series of menial, physically demanding jobs. He was a farmhand, a day laborer, an odd-job man. He was, in all respects, a marginal figure. He was not strong, charismatic, or intelligent enough to rise above his station. He was destined to remain at the bottom rung of the social ladder. And then, he found a profession that suited his temperament, a profession that existed on the ultimate margin of society. He became an undertaker's assistant and a gravedigger, a fossoyeur. Let us pause here and consider the significance of this. In any society, but especially in the deeply Catholic and superstitious culture of rural Provence, the handling of the dead is a role freighted with immense symbolic weight. It is necessary work, but it is also seen as unclean, morbid, and vaguely sinister. The undertaker and the gravedigger are figures who traffic in grief and finality. They are liminal beings, standing at the threshold between the world of the living and the silent republic of the dead. For most, this is a role to be avoided. For Victor Ardisson, it was a calling. His work provided him with something his previous jobs had not: structure, a modest but steady income, and a strange kind of authority. More importantly, it placed him in constant, intimate, and legal contact with the object of his nascent secret obsession. For most people, a dead body is an object of fear, sorrow, and solemnity, an encounter thankfully rare and buffered by ritual. For Victor Ardisson, it became daily routine. The horror was normalized. The barrier between the world of the living and the realm of the dead, so stark and sacred for everyone else, became porous, then non-existent for him. Death was his work. The cemetery was his office. And the bodies within were his inventory. Outwardly, he maintained a facade of normalcy. He eventually married a local woman, Marie, who was reportedly as simple and unassuming as he was. They set up a small home. To his neighbors in Meuilly, he was just Victor, the quiet man with the strange, shuffling gait who worked at the cemetery. He was known to be a bit odd, certainly. He had a habit of attending every funeral in the region, even for people he didn't know and when he wasn't being paid to work. He would stand at the back, his face a mask of somber attention. At the time, this was dismissed as a peculiar but perhaps understandable quirk for a man in his line of work. A professional dedication, perhaps, or a simple man's fascination with the rituals he knew best. No one suspected the truth. No one could have possibly conceived of the truth. His real life, his inner life, was lived in the dark. After the mourners had gone home, the last prayer had been said, and the heavy iron gates of the cemetery were locked for the night. The unraveling did not happen suddenly. It was a slow, creeping realization, a stain of horror spreading through the collective consciousness of the community. It began in the late 1890s, as a series of whispers and unsettling discoveries. A shepherd taking a shortcut across the fields at night claims to have seen a shadowy figure, impossibly agile, slipping over the high cemetery wall. A grieving family comes to lay flowers on a fresh grave and finds the earth disturbed, the carefully placed wreaths and crosses scattered as if by a whirlwind. A groundskeeper finds a coffin plank, splintered and mud-caked, lying inexplicably among the tombstones. At first, these were dismissed. Grave subsidence was common. Perhaps teenagers had been drinking in the cemetery. Perhaps it was the work of scavenging animals, though the thought was a disquieting one. But the incidents continued, and they grew stranger, more specific, and more horrifying. The stories began to coalesce around the graves of the recently deceased, particularly those of young women. Then came the first official reports of desecration. In that era, before the widespread use of concrete burial vaults, coffins were simple wooden boxes. They were vulnerable. When graves occasionally had to be moved for family plots or cemetery reorganization, a horrifying pattern began to emerge. Workers would open the earth to perform the exhumation, and what they found inside the coffins was a violation of all that is sacred. Bodies were not as they had been left. Burial shrouds were torn and disheveled. Limbs had been repositioned into grotesque and obscene poses. In some cases, the bodies were nude, their clothes discarded in a corner of the coffin, and most disturbingly, the corpses showed clear signs of sexual violation. The community of Meuilly was gripped by a quiet, mounting terror. This was not the work of grave robbers seeking jewelry. Valuables were largely absent, and the desecration was of a far more personal and sickening nature. This was the work of a demoniac, a fiend. The rational explanations fell away, and in their place older, darker folk beliefs began to re-emerge from the collective subconscious. They spoke of ghouls, creatures from folklore set to feast on the dead. They spoke of werewolves. And, thanks to the Gothic literature that had saturated European culture for the past century, they spoke of vampires. The regional press, ever eager for a sensational story that would sell papers, latched onto this last, most evocative explanation. The unknown perpetrator was christened Le Vampire du Marais, Vampire of Meuilly. The name was electric. It was terrifying. It transformed a series of sordid local crimes into a grand Gothic horror story. It also added a thick layer of supernatural dread, to the very real and human depravity that was taking place. The people of Mui were not just afraid of a madman. They were afraid of a monster from legend stalking their sacred ground. The local constabulary, the gendarmerie, was now under immense pressure. The violation of graves was an attack on the entire community's sense of order, family, and religious faith. The investigation was led by a man named Commissioner Tosh, a practical, no-nonsense provincial policeman. He was faced with a daunting task. There were no witnesses to the acts themselves. There was no forensic science as we know it today, no DNA, no fingerprinting databases. His investigation had to rely on deduction, intuition, and legwork. Tosh and his men worked from one central, unavoidable piece of logic. Whoever was doing this possessed an intimate knowledge of the cemetery. The perpetrator knew the layout. They knew the schedule of burials. They knew which graves were new and therefore easier to excavate. They knew how to get in and out without raising an immediate alarm. The circle of potential suspects was, in reality, exceedingly small. And at its very center, like a spider in a web, was the one man who held the keys to the gate, who knew the location of every plot, who spent his days and often his evenings on the grounds. The quiet, simple-minded gravedigger Victor Ardisson. But suspicion, however strong, is not proof. Ardisson was a known member of the community. To accuse him of such unthinkable acts without concrete evidence would be a scandal in itself. So, Commissioner Tosh did the only thing he could. He placed Ardisson under discreet surveillance. Officers began to watch him, shadowing his movements. They documented his strange, solitary habits. They noted his long, unexplained absences at night, his eerie preoccupation with funerals. The net was slowly tightening, but they needed to catch him in the act. They needed to witness the unimaginable. The moment of truth arrived in the autumn of 1901. It was precipitated by the tragic death of a young woman from the village, a girl named Jean Laugustin. She was buried in the Mui cemetery, her grave fresh and adorned with the flowers of mourning. The police were certain that this new grave, of a victim who fit the apparent profile, would be the fiend's next target. They decided to set a trap. For several nights, a team of gendarmes undertook a grim vigil. They hid themselves among the cold, silent tombstones, concealed in the deep shadows cast by the cypress trees. We can only imagine the atmosphere of that stakeout, the profound, oppressive silence of the graveyard at midnight, broken only by the rustle of leaves or the distant cry of an owl. Surrounded by the sleeping dead, they waited for a monster who walked among the living. The air would have been thick with tension, with the mixture of fear and grim determination. On the third night of their watch, their patience was rewarded. A figure emerged from the darkness at the edge of the cemetery, moving with a familiar shuffling gait that was instantly recognizable. It was Victor Ardisson. The officers held their breath, their hearts pounding. They watched in a state of horrified fascination as he approached the fresh mound of earth that marked Jean Laugustin's grave. He carried with him the tools of his trade, a shovel, a pickaxe. With a practiced, ghastly efficiency he began to dig. He worked quickly, quietly, with the economy of motion of a man performing a task he had done 100 times before. There was no hesitation. The sound of his shovel striking the wooden lid of the coffin must have echoed like a gunshot in the silent night. He pried open the lid, and as he reached inside to begin his vile work on the body within, the police sprang their trap. They burst from their hiding places, lanterns flooding the scene with sudden harsh light. Ardisson was caught, quite literally, red-handed in the grave. He looked up, his face a pale mask of shock in the lantern light, but he offered little resistance. He seemed to collapse in on himself, the energy draining out of him. It was as if, his interrogators would later note, he was almost relieved. The terrible secret he had carried for years was finally out. The vampire of Mui had been captured. His double life was over. The arrest of Victor Ardisson was the beginning of a descent into a narrative of horror that would shock even the most hardened police officers and seasoned crime reporters of the era. He was taken into custody, and what followed was not a period of denial or resistance, but a confession that flowed from him like poison from a ruptured vessel. He did not deny a single accusation. In fact, he spoke of his nocturnal activities with a chilling, unsettling frankness, a detached and sometimes even boastful tone that utterly unnerved his interrogators. It was not the confession of a man consumed by guilt, but of one finally able to speak of his life's great secret passion. He calmly recounted years of desecration, his memory for his adventures, as he sometimes called them, proving to be unerringly precise. He estimated that he had violated and interfered with the bodies of well over 100 individuals. His confession was a guided tour through a mind that operated on a logic entirely alien to normative human experience. He described an overwhelming, irresistible compulsion, an inner voice that would command him to go to the cemeteries at night. He spoke of it as a physical need, like hunger or thirst, that would grow until it was unbearable, forcing him out of his bed and towards the silent graves. He detailed his gruesome preferences with the dispassionate air of a connoisseur. His primary targets, he explained, were the corpses of young, beautiful women. He had a mental catalog of recent burials and would choose his target based on the deceased's age and appearance in life. He would sometimes dig up the bodies of men or older women, but he described these acts as being born of a kind of frustrated necessity, a lesser satisfaction when a fresher or more desirable subject was not available. His crimes were not limited to the cemetery in Muy. He admitted to making nocturnal pilgrimages to graveyards in several nearby towns, expanding his hunting ground. The details grew more grotesque. He told the police that he would sometimes dismember the bodies, taking heads or other body parts home with him. He would hide these ghastly trophies in his workshop or bury them in his garden, keeping them as mementos of his conquests. He described a bizarre and pathetic fantasy life in which these lifeless bodies were his companions, his pliant and unprotesting lovers. In his mind he animated them, holding conversations with them, treating them as partners in a macabre romance. One of his most famous and most bone-chilling quotes was widely reported in the press and encapsulated the core of his pathology. When asked why he preferred the dead to the living, he reportedly said, "Living women are disgusting. I find women much more beautiful when they are dead. There is nothing more beautiful than a woman who has just died. They don't resist." This single statement reveals a universe of misogyny, social inadequacy, and psychological distortion. Living women were complicated, demanding, possessing agency and the power to reject him. The dead were passive, silent, and eternally available. They were perfect objects for a man incapable of navigating the complexities of a real human relationship. He seemed to possess a strange dual awareness of his actions. On one hand, he described his compulsion as an external force, an illness that drove him against his will. "It's not my fault," he would insist. "I have a screw loose." On the other hand, he demonstrated a clear and calculating understanding of the clandestine nature of his acts. He knew it was wrong in the eyes of society. He knew it was a crime. He was cunning enough to vary his methods, to cover his tracks, and to evade capture for the better part of a decade. This duality, the sick man versus the cunning criminal, would become the central, unresolvable puzzle of his case. The news of his confession and the explicit details of his crimes swept through France like a firestorm. The story of the vampire of Muy was no longer a local rumor. It was a national sensation, splashed across the front pages of newspapers from Paris to Marseille. The public reaction was a tidal wave of revulsion, horror, and outrage. Here was a man who had not only committed a crime against the dead, but had violated the very idea of human dignity, family honor, and religious peace. He was a ghoul, a monster, a creature that had crawled out of a medieval nightmare into the modern, enlightened age. The popular consensus was simple and brutal. He was evil incarnate and deserved the harshest possible punishment, the guillotine. His trial, which began in November 1901 in the nearby city of Draguignan, became a national spectacle. The courtroom was packed to the rafters every day. People traveled for miles, morbidly fascinated, desperate to catch a glimpse of the man at the center of this ghoulish tale. But the trial of Victor Ardisson was destined to be more than just a public condemnation. It became a crucible, a battleground for a new way of thinking about crime, sanity, and responsibility. The central question was no longer simply, did he do it? He had confessed in vivid, undeniable detail, but why did he do it? And what does that why mean for his culpability? This is the point where our story shifts decisively from a straightforward, if horrifying French crime story to a landmark event in the intellectual history of criminal psychology. The court, as was standard practice in cases involving questionable sanity, appointed a panel of medical experts to examine Ardisson. Their task was to plumb the depths of his mind and offer a scientific opinion on his mental state. Several physicians examined him, but the most important, the man whose name would become inextricably linked with Ardisson's, was Dr. Alexis Epillard. Dr. Epillard was what was then known as an alienist, the 19th century term for a psychiatrist. He was a physician who specialized in the study and treatment of mental illness, and he was a leading figure in the new and controversial field of criminal anthropology or criminology. He was a student and disciple of the famous and highly influential Italian physician Cesare Lombroso. Lombroso's theories, while now largely discredited, were revolutionary at the time. He proposed the concept of the born criminal, arguing that criminality was not a moral choice but a biological or hereditary trait, a form of atavism or evolutionary throwback. Lombroso believed that these born criminals could often be identified by certain physical characteristics, or stigmata, things like asymmetrical faces, large jaws, or unusually shaped ears. Dr. Epillard approached Victor Ardisson not as a prosecutor would, seeing a monster, but as a biologist would, seeing a specimen. For him, Ardisson was a living case study, a perfect example of the degenerate personality type that so fascinated the medical community of the era. He spent hours upon hours interviewing Ardisson in his cell. He meticulously documented Ardisson's life story, his family history, his strange habits, his emotional responses, and his own bizarre explanations for his behavior. Epillard was searching for the scientific cause of Ardissin's depravity. What emerged from these interviews was the basis for a groundbreaking monograph that Epillard would later publish, simply titled Vampirism. In this work, he systematically dismantled the supernatural label that the press had so eagerly applied. Ardissin was not a vampire, Epillard argued. He did not drink blood, fear sunlight, or believe himself to be an undead creature of the night. His crimes, Epillard stated with clinical precision, were rooted in a complex and severe psychological condition: necrophilia, a sexual attraction to the dead, compounded by sadism. Epillard's study was one of the first, most in-depth clinical examinations of a necrophile ever conducted. He painstakingly categorized Ardissin's behaviors, attempting to build a scientific taxonomy of his madness. He noted Ardissin's demonstrably low intelligence, which he theorized made him more susceptible to his base, primitive impulses, weakening the higher brain functions of morality and self-control. He explored the crucial link between Ardissin's profession and his pathology, arguing that the daily, casual exposure to corpses desensitized him, and, critically, provided the constant opportunity for his twisted fantasies to be enacted in reality. Epillard also identified a clear sadistic component: the mutilation of the bodies, the taking of trophies. These acts went beyond a simple, perverse sexual release. They pointed to a deeper rage, a desire to defile, dominate, and destroy the object of his desire. He was not just loving the dead, he was asserting his ultimate power over them. In his final report to the court, Dr. Epillard painted a portrait of a man driven by compulsions he genuinely could not understand, let alone control. He described Ardissin as existing in a dreamlike state, or a psychic twilight during his nocturnal expeditions, disconnected from the moral implications of his actions. Epillard's conclusion was radical and deeply unsettling for the legal establishment of 1901. He argued that Victor Ardissin was, in a medical sense, insane. His condition was so severe, his impulses so morbid and irresistible, that it rendered him not legally responsible for his actions. He lacked, in Epillard's view, the moral liberty to choose otherwise. He was a broken machine, not an evil man. This argument threw a wrench into the gears of the justice system. The French legal system, based on the Napoleonic Code, was built on the bedrock premise of free will and moral responsibility. Crime was a choice and justice was the consequence of that choice. The idea that a man could commit such unambiguously heinous acts and not be evil but simply sick was a profound challenge to the entire social and moral worldview. The prosecution naturally argued the exact opposite. The state prosecutor portrayed Ardissin as a depraved but cunning monster, a monstre de luxure, or monster of lust. He pointed to Ardissin's years of secrecy, his ability to plan his expeditions, to select his victims to evade capture. This, he thundered to the jury, was not the behavior of a mindless automaton. It was proof of a calculating mind, one that knew right from wrong and consciously repeatedly chose wrong. He was, in their view, a wolf who was cleverly cloaking himself in the sheep's clothing of madness to escape his just punishment at the guillotine. The trial of Victor Ardissin thus became a public and dramatic microcosm of a larger, ongoing societal debate. On one side stood the ancient traditional view of justice: crime as a moral failing to be punished by the state. On the other stood the brash, new scientific view of criminal psychology: crime as a potential symptom of a mental or biological pathology, to be studied, treated, or at the very least, contained by medical science. The jury, composed of ordinary citizens of Provence, was faced with an impossible, almost philosophical choice. They looked at the slight, pathetic, and rather pitiful-looking man in the dock. They heard the horrifying, stomach-churning litany of his crimes read aloud. They listened to the lawyers argue about free will and moral liberty, and they listened to the alienists speak a strange new language of degeneracy, morbid impulses, and psychic determinism. The soul of Victor Ardissin was being dissected in public, and an entire nation was watching, trying to make sense of the utterly senseless. Ultimately, after days of testimony and argument, the jury had to render a verdict. They were caught between the public's primal cry for retribution and the compelling, if unsettling, testimony of the medical experts. Their decision was a remarkable compromise, a reflection of a world caught between two ages. They found Victor Ardissin guilty. The facts of the case, confessed and corroborated, were undeniable. However, in a crucial, history-making concession to the psychological evidence, they found him guilty of actus circumstances attenuants with extenuating circumstances. They accepted the argument that his profound mental defects, while not entirely absolving him of the crime in a legal sense, significantly diminished his moral responsibility for his actions. Because of this finding, Victor Ardissin was spared the guillotine. The verdict was a landmark. Instead of being executed as a monster, he was to be treated as a dangerously ill patient. He was sentenced to life with hard labor, but he was not sent to a regular prison or a penal colony like Devil's Island. He was committed to a specialized criminal asylum, the asylum of a town called Aiguesmortes, where he would live out the rest of his days under medical supervision. And so the vampire of Meuilly vanished from the public eye. The sensational headlines faded. He was locked away from the world and, most importantly, from the cemeteries that had been his kingdom and his hunting ground. He lived for another 43 years in confinement, a quiet, forgotten figure in a gray institution. He died in the asylum in 1944, during the chaos of the Second World War. His own small private horror story, which had once transfixed a nation, was utterly eclipsed by the unimaginable global tragedies of the 20th century. He died an old man of 72, a historical footnote, a case study in yellowing medical textbooks. But the story and its implications did not die with him. The case of Victor Ardisson left an indelible mark on legal and medical history. For the nascent field of criminal psychology, it was a watershed moment. Dr. Epelard's work, while viewed through the now outdated and problematic lens of degeneracy theory, was a pioneering effort in the clinical observation, documentation, and classification of extreme paraphilias. It helped move the study of such behaviors out of the exclusive realm of religious morality and into the domain of medical science. The Vampire of Meuilly became a classic, if horrifying, archetype cited in criminology and psychology lectures for generations to come, a textbook example of necrosadism. The case also serves as a powerful piece of historical true crime because it so perfectly captures the anxieties of its era. The late 19th and early 20th centuries were a time of immense fear about social decay, the perceived dangers of urbanization and industrialization, and the influence of heredity. Figures like Ardisson, poor, uneducated, and mentally defective, were seen by many as living proof of these theories, the monstrous products of bad blood and poor breeding who threatened the very fabric of civilized society. He was the bogeyman for an age terrified of its own shadows. And for us, looking back from the relative safety of the 21st century, why does this story still hold such a powerful, morbid grip on our imagination? I believe it is because Victor Ardisson represents the ultimate violation. He didn't just break a law. He transgressed against one of our most deeply ingrained pre-rational human taboos. The respect for the dead, the sanctity of the final resting place, is a cultural universal. It is a fundamental line that separates human society from chaos and savagery. Ardisson didn't just cross that line. He lived on the other side of it. He treated the dead as objects, as things, stripping them of their last vestiges of identity and dignity for his own pathetic gratification. His story also plays on another primal fear, the monster in plain sight. He was not a cackling madman or a cape-wearing phantom from a Gothic castle. He was the quiet neighbor, the simple working man, the husband. His case is a chilling foundational example of the horror at the heart of so much true crime, the gut-wrenching realization that the capacity for the most monstrous acts does not always advertise itself. The most terrifying darkness can, and often does, hide behind the most mundane of faces. The story of the Vampire of Meuilly is a dark and difficult one. It is a journey into a part of the human condition that most of us would rather pretend does not exist. But it is an important story. It reminds us that the quest to understand the why behind a crime is at least as important as the who and the what. It shows us a pivotal moment when society began to grapple with the complex, fraught, and still unresolved relationship between crime, punishment, and mental illness, a debate that continues with just as much passion and controversy in our courtrooms and our media today. Victor Ardisson, the humble, shuffling gravedigger from Provence, a man of small intellect and immense pathology, forced a nation to look into an abyss. And in doing so, he forced it to question its own understanding of justice, morality, and the terrifyingly fragile nature of the human mind. Thank you for joining us on this unsettling, but I hope illuminating exploration of the life and legacy of Victor Ardisson. It is a story that tends to stay with you, a testament to the fact that the truest and most lasting horror stories are often not works of fiction, but chapters pulled from the pages of our own history. We are left, even now, with the same profound questions that haunted the courtroom in Draguignan back in 1901. Do you believe Victor Ardisson was purely a product of a diseased mind, a man at the mercy of biological impulses he could not control? Or do you see in his years of cunning, his careful planning, and his secrecy the evidence of a calculating and truly evil nature? Where do we, as a society, draw that impossibly fine line between madness and monstrosity? We would be fascinated to read your thoughts and perspectives in the comments below. These dark histories are conversations, and every viewpoint adds a new layer to our collective understanding. If you appreciate these long, deep dives into the shadows of the past, please consider liking this video and, more importantly, subscribing to our channel. It is the single best way to support our work, and to ensure you don't miss our future journeys into history's most compelling, and often most disturbing mysteries. Until next time, try to be mindful of the quiet, hidden histories all around you, and remember that even in the sunniest of places, the shadows can run deeper than you could ever imagine. Good night.